All right. Hello, everybody. Um, oh, that's all right. Hi, everybody. Welcome to today's workshop. I believe this is the last workshop of Gear Up for today. There's just one more day left in Gear Up. It's been so awesome. I've sat in on some of the other workshops and had a really great time watching them. And yeah, thank you all for coming out tonight. So tonight's workshop will be on a deep dive into security engineering. And some of you might have been at my previous workshop this week. It's called Largescale Security Engineering. If you want to see the link for that, I believe it is uploaded to Hack the North's YouTube channel. But there's going to be a little tiny bit of overlap between the two, but almost everything is new content. So yeah, with that, I'll just get started here. And be sure to ask questions on Slido anytime you want. I'll get to them when I have the opportunity to take a look at those. All right, so just introduce myself real quick. My name is Katya, and I'm a computer science student at the University of Waterloo. I sing a cappella in my free time. I do other sorts of music-related activities, and let me just give you a little bit of a rundown on my experience in security engineering. It says engineering up there. Um, I have been involved in security engineering since fall 2019. So that term, I was on exchange at the Singapore University of Technology and Design, where I improved a machine learning model that was used to detect cyber attacks that were targeted at a water treatment system. That was a really cool experience. I hadn't really done any sort of machine learning before, but it was cool to see that. Then in winter of 2020, I worked on a cloud native email security platform developed by Abnormal Security. And I was an infrastructure engineer, so not specifically working in security, but exposed to a lot of the security principles that make companies secure and that these kinds of companies will typically embody because they're security oriented. Then fall 2020, I went on to work at Datadog as a software engineer on their community team. And there I worked on a capture the flag challenge that was presented at AWS's reInvent conference, which is their big cloud computing conference of the year. And we had about 1,700 attendees. I think most of them did try our capture the flag event. It was very challenging because we had to deploy a separate stack for each uh, player. But anyways, that's a different story. Then just this summer, I went back to Datadog as an engineer on the cloud security team, where I worked on a resource scanning service and policy enforcer. Okay, if you have any questions about any of those, I'd be happy to answer them. Let me just see if there are any. So there aren't any questions yet in the Slido, but again, feel free to ask questions at any time, and I'll get to them when I have the opportunity to. All right, cool. So what are we doing today? So to clarify, this is going to be a technical workshop, but we're going to start off with just an intro around building, I suppose, empathy for adversaries. And by empathy, I mean understanding where they're coming from and what their motivations are. That our work as security engineers is very heavily influenced by the motivations of attackers. And personally, I like to remind myself why I'm doing what I'm doing, and it helps me work more effectively. So we're going to start with that, talk about that for 10 minutes. And then for 15 minutes, we're going to analyze some security risks and some secure design principles for small web apps. Then we're going to do that for large web apps. And lastly, for cyberphysical systems. And some of these concepts will apply between systems, but I decided to segregate it this way so that we could look at a few examples that were specific to a specific kind of system. Last off, I'll just give a quick summary and answer any remaining questions. So, first off, becoming the adversary. Kind of difficult to do. I personally haven't been on that side of the internet or engaged in any sort of uh, hacking, I suppose you might call it, or um, any sort of malicious behavior. And I hope that most of the audience hasn't either. But let's try and understand why people would want to do what they do. So first of all, what is an adversary? So what we call an adversary is a group or individual that intends to perform malicious actions against resources. And under our definition, a resource is any hardware or software that's accessible by a computer, network, or other object connected to a computer. This is pretty wide ranging. It could include a computer, a communication device, a computer system, network, database, and so on. So adversaries typically wear hoodies, and if you want to really get the aesthetic, you want to find a dark server room and put a bunch of images from the Matrix up on your screen. I'm kidding. This is the Hollywood portrayal, and as I'm sure you all know, or perhaps would guess, not all adversaries look like this, or um, have this kind of setup, or even have malicious intent. So, well, what kind of adversaries are out there? So, some adversaries want financial gain. A lot of them do. And just to clarify, this doesn't include bug bounty hunters who are um, not. I wouldn't classify them as adversaries. These are people who search for bugs in applications that have made it publicly known to people that they will give some sort of bounty for a security flaw being discovered in their system. So some people choose to make a living that way, and that's a really, really, really cool job. Um, I haven't done it, but I could answer a few questions on it. I've watched a couple of streamers talk about it. So I'm not talking about that. To be clear, this is malicious financial gain. For example, someone who wants to sell your data. Grievance could be another motivation. So imagine a disgruntled employee who's just been laid off of their job and they don't really like the company they were laid off from. Maybe they might want to mess with things before they leave. Um, you know, maybe they have the know-how or the skills to do so, and that's actually a really common vector of attack that isn't often considered because you tend to trust people within your organization, maybe more than more than you should. That sounded kind of pessimistic, but it just means that you have to be careful with who has access to what resources. Third, human error. People don't have to have malicious intent to do something very, very bad for their organization's security. So, in perhaps a hurried attempt to finish off your work for the day, for example, you might accidentally click on a phishing email. It happens really, really often. There's a huge industry around discovering phishing emails and figuring out how these attackers use psychology to their advantage to take advantage of people. So, you're in a rush, you receive an email from your CEO that says, please print off these, or please buy these $300 worth of gift cards and send it to me by tomorrow at this address. And so you think, okay, I don't want to be in hot water with the CEO. So you go and do it, and then later you find out that that was a phishing attack. So human error is the third one. Fourth one is the thrill. Some people just like to try and gain access to systems just for fun. We also have political agendas and social changes. You might call these people hacktivists or ethical hackers. So these are people who want to make themselves known or draw attention to a certain issue. And lastly, there are people with terrorist agendas. And so what might each of these what might people with each of these motivations have as their goal when they're trying to attack a system? So here are some examples, and this isn't an exhaustive list by any means, but if you're trying to gain trying to gain financially, you might try to steal data, sell it, or disrupt a service. You could get paid for that too. Someone with a grievance would probably want to disrupt a service. They might also seek financial gain and, go into that first category as well. The people who expose things through human error are just trying to do their job. Um, People doing it for the thrill uh, often probably don't do anything. I, I'm generalizing a lot here, but typically they'll try to gain access, and then um, beyond that, whatever is challenging will be the next target for these people. Then people with political agendas may want to disrupt a service or draw attention again to their cause. And lastly, people with terrorist agendas seek to cause physical harm to people. So that's one of the most dangerous classes there. And we'll talk about that more when we talk about cybersecurity systems, because those are particularly vulnerable to those attacks. Gonna take a sip of coffee. All right. So an adversary's decision process. What are adversaries thinking when they're trying to decide whether they want to conduct an attack? There are three different factors that we can consider. And I got this particular framework from Deloitte. They published an interesting, I suppose, like white paper article on this. So this is just to clarify, this is a more holistic approach. Excuse me, approach to an adversary's decision process, and this doesn't all relate specifically to the role of security engineering, but I believe it's important to keep in mind all of the reasons and sort of all the steps leading up to an attack, so that you really understand, what kind of attacks might you see in the future. So first of all, if an adversary is thinking about attacking, they would probably ask themselves, do I need to attack at all? So this need is meant to address a real or imagined deprivation of something, or trying to gain something of significant value. Then second, they might ask themselves, are my actions legitimate? And this doesn't refer to any sort of law or code of conduct. It's internally justifiable action. So someone who believes that a certain country's laws uh, or a certain country's government is corrupt will not be legitimate in the eyes of the government. Their actions will not be legitimate if they choose to attack on that motive. But in their eyes, they're fighting for a civil right, and we're not going to get into that whole discussion, but it's just like an analysis of what people might be thinking at this stage in the decision process. So, are my actions legitimate? As in, will this action lead to some sort of justification, whether it's social, religious, national, personal, morals, so on. And then lastly, will my attack succeed? So, am I going to be able to carry it out? Will there be excessive consequences to me? Will I get out of this alive, or as a citizen who is still able to be free and not in jail? One example of something that might demotivate an attacker. Um, but okay, so people ask these three questions when they're thinking about becoming an adversary or engaging in a cyber attack. And as defenders, we need to make it harder for adversaries to answer yes. So that's what this decision threshold um, line is referring to. If you want to lower the decision threshold, you want to make it easier to say no to each of these questions. So what can we do to deter attacks? This um, most of what was discussed, what is discussed here, what you can see in this diagram, will refer to what a government can do. So it's not all relevant to a security engineer's behavior, but it's very underrated. I think we often focus on the last step here, which is how to prevent attacks, and there's not enough emphasis, I think, on what exactly do we promote within the tech community or within the cybersecurity community to perhaps demotivate these attacks in the first place. So if you want to reduce the perceived need to attack, you might focus on shaping behavior. And this involves using standards that encourage desirable behavior. So, for example, the belief of free exchange of information that underpinned the early internet, that was codified into standards such as TCP/IP protocols. And this helped us shape the future development of protocols. It affected what people chose to take on as defaults within their own organizations. So that's one factor to consider. Then for that second kind of aspect of the decision, the legitimacy, whether you can justify this action to yourself, you might want to deny benefits or promote messages that undercut an adversary's motives. So something like that, that might include, um, social media outreach. So that doesn't fall. That's not super close to the realm of security engineers' work, but something to consider um, is like what kind of image you're putting out there of yourself, and what sort of, um, I guess, what sort of culture do you want to encourage and participate in within security engineering and within cybersecurity in general. And lastly, impose costs. So if attackers don't think that they can execute an attack well, because it's going to be too difficult, or because it'll take them too long to set up the attack, or because there's going to be easy ways to trace them and figure out exactly who carried out the attack, thus making it easier to impose consequences, then they might be a lot less likely to actually make the attack. And this is where a lot of our focus lies as security engineers. So yes, it is important to consider all three methods of response when considering our role in the larger community. So this is an interesting website. If you haven't seen it yet, it's called haveibeenpwned.com. And let me just flip to it here. You can enter whatever email or phone you want, and you can see what kind of breaches that email or phone has been involved in. So some of these attacks might hit a little closer to home than you think. So here's an example of an email. Let's see if it's been pwned. Oh no, it has been. Um, so this have I been pwned? They recommend better security. Unfortunately, once you have been pwned, there is no way to unpwn yourself because the information is out there. But if you find that some of your personal information was involved in a breach and you don't want that to be publicly available, you may want to consider using a new email address. There are proxies you can set up. I know Firefox has a product called Firefox Relay where you can set up fake email, not really fake, but you can set up proxy email addresses that you input into whatever website you're signing up for, and that proxy will forward it to your real web address. So the original website that you entered your sign up information into, it only has the proxy, and you can turn that proxy off at any time. So you're not getting spammed, and you're also not putting your personal information out there. Here's a list of the different breaches that this particular email address was involved in. Wow. Club Penguin rewritten. That's, sounds fun. All right. I'm gonna check for questions. Club Penguin new. Yes. Uh, it is. It is unfortunate. Excuse me. All right. We're gonna move on to small scale web application threats. And we're just going to totally switch gears here. So we're going to go a little more technical, and we're going to have a few demos as well of a one particular threat that you might see in really any web app, but small web apps might be particularly susceptible to these for reasons we'll explain a little bit later. So small business owners may believe that they're too small to be a target. And small scale web apps can also be created by large businesses, but often will not have a large team behind them. So same principles apply. A small team might not think that their small, tiny service is going to be a target for attackers because who even knows about them? That is a common misconception that falls under the idea of security through obscurity. And if you saw my Hack the North story feature at all, you might have also heard this discussed. Um, I believe there was a question about uh, how how can you hide the components of an app that deal with the security of that app. So you you can hide things, and you should definitely make sure that your sensitive information is hidden, like passwords or API keys, and you can store those in a database and encrypt them and so on. But the code itself doesn't need to be hidden to ensure a secure ecosystem or a secure app. And the reason is because these systems should be secure by design. Security through obscurity is I'll put the definition up. It's relying on design or implementation secrecy as the main method of providing security to a system or component. So, and sorry if I'm repeating myself and if you've seen this, but the example I use is if you have a key under your doormat, um, your idea of security there is that, okay, or like let's say a spare key under your doormat, just in case you forget your main key to your home. The idea there is that people don't see what's under the doormat, or they might not think to look under there. So probably the key is sort of secure. But if someone really wants to gain access to your home, they will probably find that key because it's just hidden. Once it's been discovered, there's nothing keeping it secure. And compare that to storing the key in a lockbox on your front door. Now, everyone can see that your key is there and it's in a lockbox, but they don't know how to open the lockbox, and they don't. If you choose a good password, they don't know they probably won't be able to guess the password. So that same principle applies here. If even if you think you're a kind of very small web app and that nobody's really going to target you, there are many reasons for attackers to still target small apps. For example, they might have access to large amounts of customer data, or they might deal with large sums of money, and these are both great targets for attackers. And in addition to that, smaller web apps tend to have less security protocols in place, which makes it easier to break into. And it's also easy for attackers to automate attacks on hundreds or thousands of businesses at once. So they don't have to go through, a directory of businesses and click through every single page that you have on your app. This is all very, very easy to automate, and it is automated regularly. So I'm gonna grab some more coffee, but we'll look at some specific threats in this section. So first off, we have denial of service. This is when an adversary makes a resource unavailable to its users, and usually it'll do this by flooding or crashing a resource. So, for example, um, an attacker might send a lot of requests from a single computer, or they might send a lot of requests from multiple computers. And this would be called a distributed denial of service attack because it's distributed across multiple computers. Um, then we have cross-site scripting, which is a bug that allows adversaries to add their own malicious JavaScript code onto HTML pages displayed to users. We're going to take a look at a demo of this in a second. And then we have SQL injection. So this is where malicious code is inserted into strings that are passed into a SQL server for parsing and execution. And what could happen here is in the input field, someone could add perhaps an asterisk, a semicolon, and then a SQL command. That's a very basic example, but when that particular piece of input is processed, if the input is not parsed as just a string, if it's possible to parse the input as something other than a string, as for example a SQL command, then whatever command was entered there could very easily be executed. So that's that attack. Then we have cross-site request forgery, which is when unauthorized commands are performed from a trusted user's browser. And lastly, broken access control. It's a pretty general term to refer to access that is given to users incorrectly. So when you're trying to give access to a user, you that is the process of authorization, and that should come after authentication, which is the process of figuring out that a user is who they say they are. So sometimes, if authentication doesn't come before authorization, you might authorize someone that you don't even know if they're the right user. You might give them the ability to access a resource that they shouldn't have access to. And now we're gonna take a look at this REPL right here. And let me see if I can actually paste that into the chat for you. So this is a fun little toy example that I found on Google's, I believe it's their app security learning page. So they have a few different demos there that you can go through as well. And they just demonstrate basic web exploits that you might find basically anywhere you look. I'm gonna try and just zoom in on this bit, a little bit. Let's do large font size. Yeah, so these are pretty ubiquitous attacks that also have second and third order attacks. So, for example, like SQL injection, you might see frameworks that kind of combat SQL injections by using formatted strings, for example, where it's impossible to read the string as anything but a string. But then you can get a second order SQL injection where you exploit that framework and kind of circumvent it to still achieve the same outcome with a few more steps. So this is a first order. This is a pretty basic example of a cross-site scripting exploit. So here we've got our service. It's called Blatherbox, and it's really cool invention. It's you can just post comments here. So share status. So it's pretty cool. Yeah, surprised no one's come up with that before. But let's try and enter something that's not standard input here. Let's try this tag right here. So what does this do? So we have an opening tag, image source equals X, on error equals alert, pop-up window via stored XSS. Let's try sharing that and see what happens. Oh my gosh, a pop-up window came up. That's not part of our code. Let's look through the script here. No, we don't have any alerts. So this alert must have come from the input that we just added here. So what happened here was that we referenced some image that we don't know its source. It's X. So the it's going to look up image source equals X, error out, and then it's going to call this alert dialog on error. And this is happening because it's a similar problem to a SQL injection where the input in this box right here is just being processed, and it's just we don't really care about making sure that it's a string and that it's not processed as code. So in this case, even if we refresh the page, we still get this pop-up window. And so you can play around with that a little bit, clear all posts if you want to clear them. But we have another one that's a little spookier. This one is from Google, and so this is some random script, and we don't even know what's doing. This isn't doing anything here. We have um, replacing your stream with an evil post. There is nothing like that in this repository here, but as you can see, our post has been hacked. So um, that's just one example of a cross-site scripting exploit. Okay, and so how do you prevent attacks like these? First of all, you can use firewalls, which can analyze traffic to and from a web server and defend against known threats as well as unknown threats. And it can also detect and prevent against anomalous behavior. So, for example, if you see that one IP address is spamming your service, you can block it or limit, give it a rate limit, 1,000 requests per minute or something like that. Second, you can use frameworks with secure design, and this is a very, very good thing to do. It's one of the easiest ways to prevent security attacks is to make sure that you're secure, you're using secure first design. The idea there is that why prevent attacks if you could prevent them, if you could prevent the vulnerabilities from being created in the first place. So, oh, and you can see the replit there if you wanna play around with that. There's a little README in the bottom right that where you can see the commands that I just executed. Yeah, so the best way to prevent cross-site scripting attacks, the ones that we just saw, is to use a web framework that avoids them altogether. Because doing your own kind of escaping logic or creating your own secure logic is very difficult to do because you have to consider a lot of levels of security that you might not even have the scope to consider, even as a security engineer. It's easier when someone else has paved the way for you and kind of designed those principles for you. Third, have a good deploy process. So you can have something like post commit hooks. That's a pretty basic example of something you could do in your deploy process. And if you're kind of unfamiliar with deploy processes in general, um, this is the process that your changes will go through when they're being deployed to production or when you are pushing your changes to a web app to production. Production will be the server that is hosting content for users. So usually, you'll develop code on your own machine, and then you have perhaps a development environment, and that's just visible to you, so you can test out your changes, and then you put your changes up in a pull request. People review it on GitHub or GitLab or whatever you use, SVN, and then you so when you're pushing your changes, you would call that well, in the case of post commit hooks, that would be referenced in a commit. And what you can do is that whenever you commit changes, after they've been committed, you can execute some basic security tests. So, for example, something that does what we just saw, perhaps tries to execute a cross-site scripting attack on your code. And if it succeeds, then the test fails and your pull request doesn't get approved. You go back, fix the change, and then you're good to go. And the advantage of having a good deploy process is that the rules are consistent for every single change that goes in. So you don't need to rely on somebody remembering 1,000 different security principles. You you should still have someone that understands them, but it's easier when you can rely on automation and tests to do that for you or do the bulk of the work for you. Okay, so and we also there's a threat model analysis tool that we can use, and we're going to see a variation of this in the cybersecurity section. So I'll just go over this briefly, but the idea here is that when you're trying to see if there is a threat to your application, you just go through a few steps to organize that information and make it easy for other people on your team or people who aren't security engineers to see, why do we need to make a change, or what specifically is the impact of this threat. So first you collect background info. You try to understand your app. You try to understand your attackers, just like we did 5 or 10 minutes ago, kind of try and understand motives and potential potentially valuable resources or pieces of data. Second, you create and analyze the threat model. So that's just everything encompassing a threat. It's like you've got the attacker, and then you've got the system that's being attacked. And third, you review the threats. So you'll perhaps assign a certain difficulty score or a valuation depending on exactly what it is at stake. And then lastly, identify mitigation techniques. I'm just going to show you a quick example of this. All right, so here we have a threat model analysis for HTTP and SOAP adapters. Now, nobody uses SOAP anymore, but um, that's fine. We have this sample architecture here. So internet, got a firewall, like 2 firewalls here, a perimeter network that connects. I'm not exactly sure why they have this setup, but I think it's just here as an example. Um, here you have a BizTalk server, and this will track hosts. There's a secret server, and that's probably going to store secrets for that particular ecosystem. So, that could include API keys potentially. SQL Server is probably for user data administration tools. That's for reviewing the architecture, potentially the architecture of the system, or also just reviewing some of the configurations. Okay, so you have your sample architecture, and first you collect information. You can use a data flow diagram, and this is a little bit. I would say when you're um, I haven't personally created one of these, but I think the idea here is to visualize where your data is going so that you can understand what are kind of what are the different points at which an attacker could access a specific bit of data. So, coming from a customer, you have an inbound message. Then you have a reverse proxy that sends that message and also authentication data related to that customer to a router. And then that's going to send the message to this BizTalk server. Then the decrypted message will go to a message box database. And that same decrypted server will go to the BizTalk server. So potentially these two steps here are particularly high risk because the message is decrypted. So it will be easier for attackers to read it if they manage to access that. And then from here, the process message goes back, and it could be routed all the way back to the customer. All right, so that's step 1, and then step 2, we have a few threat models here, and actually, let me zoom in on this. Must be really, really small. Let me zoom in. So one threat is sending an infinite size message, and this is a denial of service attack. So if a user sends a message of infinite size to the BizTalk server environment here, it looks like that'll get processed and potentially take down that server. It looks like it looks like these threats are actually confirmed threats within this particular architecture. So there are actually a lot more that are possible in general, but for this particular example service, these are the threats that they discovered. We have another denial of service attack here. Sent a lot of messages to receive location. This is an interesting one. Read message bodies over HTTP. So if a malicious user manages to intercept the message from the sender to firewall 1, they may be able to read the message, which would result in information disclosure. So if you can see here, so it looks like right here in this link, there's an HTTP connection, which is not secure. And then this last one is another information disclosure threat. So if you use basic authentication and the message contains user credentials, a malicious user can gain access to the credentials and use them to access the application. This is particularly this could be the first step in a multi-step attack because once you have access to a user, you can elevate your privileges from there, and you have access to a system from a user's perspective. So you can, there might be a few more sort of areas where you can impact the ecosystem or this particular app. So here they review the threats and they look at the damage potential, reproducibility, exploitability, affected users, and discoverability. And they'll sum these all up to indicate a risk exposure at the end. So it looks like the highest risk threat here is this third one, the reading message bodies over HTTP. And each team has a different way of doing this and assigning these points, and some teams don't assign points at all. They'll just kind of have a discussion and decide which kind of risks that they want to target first or shore up first, which vulnerabilities they would want to shore up first. And then step 4 is identifying a mitigation technique. So how do you fix this? So if you want to fix the infinite size message problem, you can limit the maximum size of an incoming message and reject messages that exceed that maximum. Some more information here. So anyways, yeah, and you can go through these, and maybe I'll send that link as well. Okay, and so let's move on to large-scale web apps. So large-scale web apps are we have a question. I'm so sorry you had to wait 16 minutes for that. But the question is cross-site request forgery just stealing cookies and using those cookies to impersonate? So that's a good question. And I'm just gonna look up a quick resource because I don't want to give you the wrong information. But there are a few different ways in which you can transmit those commands. So as far as I know, I think cookies would work for that. You can use image tags, you can use hidden forms, and there's XML HTTP requests. And this involves specifically exploiting the trust in a browser rather than a site. So yeah, the cookies are one part of that. Okay, so large scale web app threats. We have a lot of at large scale companies or the kind of companies that maintain these web apps will typically have a team of dedicated security engineers to make sure that the entire ecosystem is secure. They might run some training with employees, or they might not. Or rather, engineers would probably not run the training, but the cybersecurity team might run some sort of periodic training to make sure that people are aware of phishing attacks in particular and other kinds of attacks. So that front is covered. And then there's also a lot of automation and a lot of tooling that is involved in when you get to the point where you're processing large amounts of data or large amounts of money. So there are a lot of systems in place to protect these apps, but these systems may contain multiple defenders, which don't necessarily share consistent security techniques, and this can lead to gaps in security. So some of the kind of breaches that we saw earlier, they will still be possible in larger scale web apps, but um, let's take a look at some of the automation tools that can prevent these attacks. So one of these tools is called semgrep, and this is a really great tool that um, essentially will a part of what it does is it replaces some bit of code or configuration with another that is potentially better formatting or more secure. And so semgrep .dev/r is where you can go to take a look at some of those. I'll link that as well. So well, let's look at a few of these here. So the first one that I found here is a JWT specific rule. So this will avoid common security mistakes in JSON web tokens. And these are JSON web tokens are used to verify the identity of people, so they can be used as bearer tokens or authentication tokens. And let's look at the first rule here. So you can open this in their playground, and this is a good way to expose yourself to the kind of uh, the kind of stuff you would see in production right now. So the toy example that I gave earlier with cross-site scripting, you would probably not see that in a modern app because there's typically frameworks that are used to process input, and these frameworks are secure. We would hope that they have secure design in mind, and a lot of them do. So these are kind of these rules are specifically targeting kind of very small segments of a particular bit of business code that you might use. So typically, this will involve something that you specifically have to write, and that typically might not be provided through a framework. So for example, here, we're already using this JWT Go library, but the step that is targeted here is the decoding of a token without a verify step. So you don't, you shouldn't use this method parse unverified unless you know what you're doing, as it says here. Um, this method is only useful in cases where you know the signature is valid because you've checked it previously in the stack and you then want to extract values from it. So, in this case, semgrep would kind of scan through, and it's a very, very fast tool. It's and it would match on this particular line here and tell you why exactly it's matched on that line and why it's bringing this to your attention. So, and you don't necessarily need to act on this. It's not like you absolutely must use a like the parse verified method or whatever the verified alternative is. If you know that you've already parsed this and you know you've done what it says here, which is where you've parsed it previously in the stack, then you're good to go. Let's look at another one. So here's cross-site scripting again. Let's open up the first one. Okay, so this example says text/template doesn't escape HTML content. And if you need to escape HTML content, you should use HTML template instead. So escaping here refers to escaping the string that is inputted. So if you are looking to make sure that your input is not going to have a script in it, if your input happens to contain a script or some sort of HTML tag that might execute a script, you want to be sure that that will be escaped, or that will be processed as a string and not processed as code. So here, if you were to change this to what it recommends, which is HTML template, and I don't know if this is the right case here. I just opened this this test case here, but then you're going to see that there's no matches. So it's a pretty cool tool, and I would recommend that if you're interested in having a kind of very specific idea of what kind of security vulnerabilities you might see in production nowadays, just take a look through these rules. They're all publicly available, and I believe you just need to sign up for SemGrep if you want to open them in the playground. All right, moving on to cyberphysical systems. So we have kind of a different set of challenges here because there's a lot more hardware involved in cyberphysical systems, and these systems tend to be very high risk. So they can affect critical systems like hospital monitors or sewage treatment plants. And so the term cyberphysical system refers to a system in which a mechanism is controlled or monitored by computer-based algorithms. It's think about like when you have a web app, of course, it's running on physical servers, and there are physical components to your security that you need to consider, like making sure that those servers are in a secure environment. If you're with a cloud provider, it's probably kind of out of your hands, but a cyber physical system might have servers that are running the code, and then it might have sensors that are reading some sort of input. Let's say in a water treatment system, you have sensors that are reading water levels, and then you have some sensors that, or you have small computers that will control the opening and closing of different valves, or the speed at which different pumps are operating. And then all of these sensors and computers are all of their data is being sent to a central workstation where an administrator can take a look and make sure that everything is running as it should. So there are a lot of physical components in these systems, and so we there's a little bit more uncertainty involved there, and there's also a lot more places where you might potentially have a security breach and not really be able to automate that because it's physical, or you might have a harder time automating it. Here's a quick concept map. I hope that's showing up okay, but it's basically just it's showing different components of a cyber-physical system. So in the middle there, you can see we have cybersecurity, and there's verbs connecting each of these terms. So cyber-physical systems require cybersecurity, which imperils safety. Kind of an obvious statement, but if you want to sort of understand what goes into these systems, there are a lot of since these are a lot of these systems are also monitored and secured by the government. We have a lot of kind of very formal processes in place for securing them, and a lot of formal concept maps to try and understand what goes into that process. So an example of a breach that might not really come to mind is a this example from a pair of security researchers from an unknown source. Uh, but I found the story interesting. Said these researchers scared a tech journalist by taking control of his car from their office. And they just found the car on the internet and broke into its entertainment system. So you don't have to do all that much to sort of imperil someone's life here. You can humans are kind of very fallible. If you distract somebody for a split second through very loud noise sent over an entertainment system, that might be enough to distract their attention from the road. And then it's a bit of a grim picture, but that's just sort of to illustrate why these are so high risk. So we'll use a threat analysis strategy. We'll just go through one of these strategies that's been developed by the Federal Emergency Management Agency. And this is part of the US Department of Homeland Security. So if you are going into cyber-physical systems, be prepared for a lot of these 5-step frameworks, 7-step, 4-step. They all have a different amount of steps, and they all have different processes involved. So the reason I think part of the reason for this is because you want to have if you're working on these systems, you want to have a very clear process for showing people that you have considered all of the different facets that go into securing these resources, and you want a good way to kind of audit them and also reproduce the security principles that you've implemented, in previous audits. So we have a few steps here. So these also apply to natural disasters. First off, you identify a threat. So under this framework, they're categorized as natural, technological, and man-made. We're just going to look at cybersecurity specific threats. And then we have steps 2 and 3, which involve profiling the threats and developing a community profile. So these threats can be categorized into profiles with more detailed information, which includes the type of threat, the probability of its occurrence, and any other relevant history. And then you can create a community profile, which is comprised of geography, property, infrastructure, and demographics. So if you're looking at online, kind of taking this online, you could look at what kind of traffic the service typically receives. Also, since it is a cyber-physical system, the geography and infrastructure is still relevant there. You might want to look at the first responder presence within the area as well. So if something goes wrong, let's say in a water treatment plant or okay, let's say a nuclear plant, then you want to see who's in that area to help out if something does go wrong. And then step 4, we want to determine the vulnerability of this system. So we can prioritize different response systems um, depending on kind of like the example that I showed you from Microsoft earlier, the small web app that we saw where we went through a threat model analysis. So here we can also kind of assign points and prioritize different responses depending on so not only prioritizing the threats but also prioritizing what's going to be the most effective way to combat this threat. And you typically want more than one way to approach a problem because each threat or each attack is going to be a little bit different and have perhaps some different risks or stakeholders involved. So this means we figure out the most likely threats and we choose the best responses to those threats. And then last off, we create disaster scenarios to reflect the biggest and most likely threats. So these are the most ominous threats that can, the ones with the most negative consequences, and also the most likely threats. So typically, you don't want to prioritize a very, very devastating event that is very, very unlikely to happen, like an asteroid colliding into one of your sensors. It's probably not going to happen. But let's say your system is in a very high traffic place where it would be easy for somebody to potentially access one of the sensors and not be noticed. That might be kind of something you consider when you're creating one of these. When you're creating one of these scenarios. Well, here's an example of a cyber-physical system here, but I think here I kind of wanted to look into something I also linked in the hack pack. And this is the SANS white papers. So I just wanted to share some resources for you to get a closer look, because I do feel like it's hard to even get a general idea in an hour. As we saw, there are a lot of different motivations, and there are a lot of different schools of thought and frameworks to approach these problems. So just kind of giving you the tools to keep looking and keep um, sort of investigating on your own time if you're interested in um, being a security engineer, or if you're just interested in the general principles involved. So this is one of the um, better resources that I found on that lists white papers, and these are just resources for teams that are looking to improve their processes. Um, there are quite a lot of these, and SANS is uh, I don't know if they I know they have some of the best, if not the best, certifications and courses for people looking to be security engineers. And this is specific to security engineering and not software engineering on a security team. I think that distinction is also important, because a lot of teams will look for people who have these certifications and know the security principles. But a lot of teams will also just look for security engineers who have been given directives to automate a certain thing or provide a certain tool uh, in the interest of improving a team's or an organization's security. So there's kind of two avenues you can take. And if you're looking to be a security engineer, I think it's good to kind of educate yourself and maybe like look into taking some of these courses. So these are just very informative, detailed papers on whatever you might think of. You can search through these, and there are different kind of categories here. So just to explain some of these terms, blue team refers to teams that aren't trying to kind of penetrate a system. So you might see also like the kind of flip side of that is red team. So the red team will typically try to penetrate a an organization's security system, and um, they're not attackers. Their goal is to discover vulnerabilities. So they kind of simulate attacks on an organization. But a blue team is there to find ways to defend against the red team. So it's kind of like an ongoing battle between them, all in the interest of improving security. So we have well, let's look at securing cell phones as an example. Maybe I can show you kind of how to skim some of these articles. It's going to take a little while to load. You do need a username to log into this resource. So, and I see we're running a bit over time here. I'll take questions in just a second. So here we have a very clear introduction. Looks like it was sponsored by BlackBerry and Cisco Umbrella. So anyways, so mobile endpoints continue to surpass other devices when it comes to browsing traffic on the internet. As the number of mobile devices increases, um, attacks rise too, and users might wonder who is responsible for making sure these devices are secure. So this paper looks at tips for securing mobile devices, various layers of protection, recent attacks, poll results highlighting concerns related to mobile security. And so you can kind of look through this, and it'll a white paper is not, it's not a research paper, so it'll typically be written in a more user-friendly way, um, perhaps not as rigorous, but very informative and good to read over, if and good to also kind of look and see what interests you most if you're looking to also specialize within cybersecurity. And then something else we can look at is and this is also linked in your hack packs, but this is the CVE team. So this is the main kind of website. CVE provides a list of vulnerabilities that have been discovered, and it'll also give you metadata um, on these vulnerabilities. And this is, you can just follow their Twitter account to see what the most recent discovered vulnerabilities are. So let's refresh this. I wonder if there have been any that came out during this talk. Oh, there haven't been. So the most recent one was discovered 3 hours ago. Heap buffer overflow in this particular function, which can be exploited via a crafted file. So this is a very good resource for anyone who is looking to make sure that their system, or anyone who has a system that has um, perhaps multiple dependencies to the point where it's difficult to perhaps test each one of the dependencies and make sure that they all comply with whatever security requirements you have. Um, and also, if you're just interested in seeing what the most recent exploits are, yeah, you can take a look here. You've got a SQL injection in this CMS here. And so if you click into this also, you can see a few different fields here, the description. This is going to be a universal ID that you can search up and perhaps gain some more information, find some news articles on it. And so the press around security vulnerabilities is also pretty important to keep track of, to kind of see how things are being conveyed to the public. So for example, well, GitHub is not a news website, but they will notify you if you have a repository that contains a reference to, or sorry, I believe it's if you forked a repository that has publicly declared some security flaw or a severe security breach. So it'll prompt you to update to the most recent version of that particular dependency, or perhaps stop using it altogether. Right. So let's just go back here. Right. That's all about all I had for the scheduled content. And I know we're going over time here, but if anyone has any questions, I would be happy to take them while anyone is crafting questions. If you are, you can take a look at these. I have some extra resources here. Let me just copy some of those for you. Actually, you know what? It looks like all of the resources that I did want to share with you, I have already been posted in the chat, so you can scroll through the comments and take a look. But this is just wanted to credit some of the places where I source my content. So some of the notable ones are the security case studies from Microsoft. So we took a look at some of the potential factors involved in a threat analysis of a smaller scale web app. Microsoft has a few more of those for different kinds of servers and architectures. Then we had at the bottom there, the Google App Security cross-site scripting demo. They have a lot of other demos if you're looking to gain a deeper understanding of some of these security flaws. And I also looked at this paper up here combining hybrid input-output automation and game theory for security modeling of cyberphysical systems. This is a pretty cool paper that I didn't have time to go into, but it kind of explains how you can use game theory to analyze the biggest threats to an ecosystem, or the biggest the resources that might pose the biggest a vulnerability. So, um, and this is interesting because this kind of cross disciplinary sort of research is I find it's sometimes well, a lot of it is very insightful and um, people don't always look beyond their own field, I suppose, to source ideas. There's infamous examples of people reinventing principles that have been discovered in other disciplines. And if you're looking to go into research, it's very um, that kind of interdisciplinary research is very appealing, and it's very useful for making sure that no information is just siloed in one industry. A few questions here. So first off, what got you interested in security engineering? Um, so I just um, the first kind of my first foray into security engineering was just out of curiosity mostly. I looked at some of the other projects, and some of them involved AR, and some of them involved more back-end work. And I'd done back-end work before, so it wasn't that interesting to me. And AR is cool, but I wanted to have a bigger impact within the places where I was working. Security seemed like a clear kind of avenue for that, and I don't know if I'm gonna continue in security engineering for my entire career, but most likely not. Um, just to explore different fields and all. It's good to do that, but I think it's particularly. I think there's definitely a lack of good security engineers, and um, now that sort of the ecosystem of dependencies is kind of and that's a pretty vague statement to make, but now that we see a lot more policies coming into play uh, with regards to data protection and GDPR, and kind of more of a focus on that, um, it's it's good to be in a space where uh, that that companies are going to need workers to implement those policies. As a security engineer, so the next question is, as a security engineer on the software side, are there any regulatory requirements your code needs to meet when working with cyberphysical systems? Great question. Um, there are, yes, um, sometimes. So it depends on where you're working. Um, some places will kind of rely on just blocking access, public access to these the security systems that they're working on, and you'll sign NDAs and all to make sure that if you do happen to disclose anything or um, do something you shouldn't do with your code, then there will be consequences for that. But um, there's different, like one of the companies I worked at was SOC 2 compliant, and they were HIPAA compliant. And these are policies that are enacted to protect people's information, health records, um, any sort of personally identifiable information. And so when I'm working in these systems, even not even as a security engineer, but as any software engineer, I have to make sure that I'm not, for example, posting people's personal information on Slack because we don't really know where Slack stores their data, and there's certain kind of trust relationships that we have with certain apps and that we don't have with others. Um, but yeah, great question. It really depends. Where can you find security engineering internships? It tends to be easier, as with most specializations, when you have one security or one experience in that field already on your resume. So when I had that initial research opportunity, it was a lot easier for me to go into security internships after that because even if I hadn't necessarily worked as a security engineer in the way that that company wanted me to work, I still had a good exposure of or a good understanding of basic security principles, or at least you would kind of pick up on that after 4 months or so of working on something security related. All right. Well, I think I'm gonna call it here because we're 15 minutes over already. But if you need to, um, or not if you need to, uh, take a look at the Slido link, um, so that you can leave an honest honest review, answer a few questions about how this workshop went, how you liked it. It would really help myself, and would help Hack the North as well, organize better workshops in the future, and just keep improving our knowledge, and yeah, just keep getting better. So I want to thank you all very much for attending this workshop. Be well, stay hydrated, and hope you have a really great time at the rest of Gear Up and at Hack the North. Have a wonderful evening.